The scent of old paper and decaying leather was the only perfume Eleanor Vance wore with confidence. In the quiet solitude of her tiny apartment, surrounded by the hushed whispers of forgotten stories, she was a restorer of worlds. Her slender fingers, stained with ink and glue, moved with a surgeon's precision across a fractured spine, gently coaxing the brittle pages of a 19th-century novel back into alignment. This was her sanctuary, a place where broken things could be made whole again. At 27, Ellie felt more kinship with these damaged artifacts than with the living, breathing city that throbbed with a life she only observed from behind a window. She was a ghost in her own narrative, her existence a series of careful, apologetic movements designed not to disturb the world around her. If you want to discover what happens when a woman who mends broken things meets a man who is shattered beyond repair, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. Her life hadn't always been this silent. For a decade, it had been a cacophony of beeping machines, whispered consultations with doctors, and the rhythmic, labored breathing of her mother. Ellie had been a full-time caregiver since she was a teenager, her youth traded for a vigil of love and duty. Her virginity wasn't a moral stance or a conscious choice. It was a byproduct of a life lived in service, a garden untended while she cared for another. There was simply no room for dates, for flirtation, for the fumbling, messy exploration of self that others took for granted. Now, a year after her mother's passing, the silence was a deafening roar. The apartment, once a sanctuary of care, was now just an empty space, and the freedom she had once craved felt less like liberation and more like an abyss, a vast, terrifying emptiness she didn't know how to fill. By day, the quiet artist of the night became a nearly invisible executive assistant at Blackwood Capital, a soulless monolith of reflective glass and polished steel that scraped the New York sky. The building was a physical manifestation of everything she was not: cold, ambitious, and brutally efficient. She took the job for the punishingly high salary, the only weapon she had against the mountain of medical debt her mother had left behind, a final, crushing inheritance. She moved through the open-plan office like a foreigner in a hostile land, her modest cardigans and gentle demeanor, a stark contrast to the sharp suits and sharper smiles of her colleagues. They were predators in a concrete jungle, and Ellie, with her quiet ways and apologetic eyes, was a creature of a different, more fragile species, completely out of her element and painfully aware of it every single second. Her clumsiness was a constant low-grade humiliation. It was a physical manifestation of her profound unease, a body rebelling against a world where it didn't belong. A fumbled stack of documents would scatter across the marble floor like fallen leaves, earning her a chorus of impatient sighs. A spilled coffee would stain the pristine white desk of a senior partner, resulting in a condescending remark that would burn in her cheeks for hours. She learned to make herself smaller, to hug the walls of the corridors, to speak in a voice so soft it was easily ignored. Her colleagues saw her as incompetent, a meek mouse who had somehow scurried into the lion's den. They didn't see the fierce intelligence behind her timid gaze, or the deep well of empathy that made this cold, transactional world so painful for her to inhabit. She was simply the clumsy assistant, an easy target for their casual cruelty. This sense of inadequacy followed her home, seeping into the quiet corners of her apartment. The freedom she now possessed was a cruel paradox. For years, her purpose had been clear, her days structured around another's needs. Now, with no one to care for, she was adrift. The dreams she had once harbored, opening a small book restoration workshop, traveling to see the libraries of the world, felt like aspirations belonging to a different person, a stranger from a life she had never been allowed to live. Who was Eleanor Vance when she wasn't a daughter, a nurse, a caregiver? The question echoed in the lonely silence of her evenings. She would stand before her mirror and see a stranger, a woman of 27 with the unlived-in eyes of a much younger girl, trapped in a state of arrested development and terrified that it was already too late to begin. The memory of her mother was both an anchor and a cage. She could still feel the phantom weight of her mother's hand in hers, hear her voice whispering words of encouragement, reminding her of her own strength. This fierce, unconditional love had been Ellie's bedrock, the moral compass that guided her through the darkest days. Yet it was also the source of an immense unspoken guilt. Her mother had sacrificed everything, enduring a life of pain with unwavering grace. How could Ellie now complain about loneliness? How could she dare to want more for herself? More joy, more passion, more life, when her mother had been denied so much? The thought felt like a profound betrayal. And so, she honored her mother's memory by remaining small, by not taking risks, by continuing to live a life of quiet duty, convinced that she did not deserve the very things her mother would have wanted for her. As dusk settled over the city, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Ellie would often stand by her window, looking out at the endless constellation of lights. Each light represented a life, a story unfolding, a world of connection and experience she could only imagine. A deep, unnamed yearning would rise within her, a physical ache in the center of her chest. It wasn't just a desire for love or companionship, but a craving for sensation itself, for a touch that wasn't clinical, for a conversation that wasn't transactional, for a single moment that was entirely and unapologetically her own. She felt like a book with pristine, unread pages, waiting for someone or something to finally crack the spine and begin the story. She didn't know that in the tallest, darkest tower of the city, a man as broken as her rarest books was about to turn the first page. The city itself was a form of oppression, a relentless assault on her senses that began the moment she stepped outside her door. The morning commute was a daily submersion into a river of anonymous, determined bodies, all rushing toward lives she couldn't comprehend. On the subway, pressed between a man in a bespoke suit and a woman with a designer handbag, Eleanor would make herself impossibly small, her gaze fixed on the grimy floor. The roar of the train was a physical vibration in her bones, a constant reminder of the city's power and her own insignificance within it. She was a single, faded thread in a vibrant, aggressive tapestry. And every day she felt the risk of simply unraveling, of disappearing completely into the overwhelming noise and ambition that defined the urban landscape she was forced to inhabit, but could never truly call her own. The most tangible of her shackles arrived in the mail, crisp, white envelopes bearing the logos of hospitals and collection agencies. They were the ghosts of her mother's long illness, a financial haunting that dictated every choice she made. Each letter was a paper cut to her soul, a stark reminder that her life was not her own. It belonged to this ledger of suffering. The six-figure sum was an impossible mountain, and her job at Blackwood Capital was the tiny, inadequate pickaxe she used to chip away at it. This debt was her silent, demanding partner. It dictated the cheap brand of tea she bought, the threadbare coat she wore, and the solitary evenings she spent, because every dollar spent on a moment of joy felt like a theft from the sacred, crushing obligation she had inherited. Her mother's memory, once a source of comfort, had begun to feel like a gilded cage. In her mind, she could still hear her mother's voice, weakened by illness but firm in its convictions, speaking of the life she envisioned for her daughter. A simple life, a safe one, with a kind, stable husband and the quiet joys of a family. It was a life her mother had been denied, and so it became her final, fervent wish for Ellie. This posthumous expectation weighed on Ellie with the force of a commandment. To pursue her own nebulous dreams of art and independence felt like a desecration of that wish. It was easier, safer, to honor her mother by remaining the dutiful daughter, by preparing herself for a life she didn't want, because the guilt of disappointing the woman who gave her everything was a burden too heavy to bear. Her apartment, the only space that was truly hers, had become a museum of her former life. Every object was an artifact of her role as a caregiver. Her mother's worn shawl was still draped over the back of the sofa, the scent of her lavender soap faintly clinging to the threads. The bookshelf was filled not with the classics Ellie loved, but with medical texts and books on palliative care. She lived within the architecture of her grief, unable to move a single piece of furniture for fear of disturbing the delicate ecosystem of memory. This self-imposed stasis was a way of keeping her mother close, but it also prevented any new life from taking root. The air was thick with the past, suffocating the present and making any vision of a future impossible to conjure. She was the curator of her own stagnation. The social landscape of Blackwood Capital was a barren, inhospitable terrain. Lunch in the sterile break room was a masterclass in exclusion. Conversations swirled around her, a vortex of topics from a universe she didn't occupy. Weekend trips to the Hamptons, complaints about canceled reservations at Michelin-starred restaurants, the complex politics of high society dating. Ellie would sit with her simple, homemade sandwich, her silence a protective cloak. Her attempts to join in were met with polite, dismissive smiles before the conversation seamlessly flowed around her, leaving her beached on an island of her own making. They weren't intentionally cruel. She was simply invisible to them, her quiet reality so far removed from their glittering existence that she might as well have been a ghost haunting the coffee machine, a silent witness to a world she could never enter. The external pressure was given a voice by her Aunt Carol, her mother's older sister, who called every Sunday with a predictable script of thinly veiled pity. "Eleanor, darling, you're not getting any younger," she would begin, her voice syrupy with concern. "It's not healthy to be so alone. Your mother, bless her soul, would want you to find a nice man, to settle down. This job in the city, it's so harsh. It's no place for a sensitive girl like you." Each word was a small, sharp stone, building a wall of expectation around Ellie. Aunt Carol's version of happiness, a suburban house, a respectable husband, felt like a life sentence. The calls always left her feeling hollowed out, as if her own unformed desires were being methodically erased and replaced by a future designed by committee, a life pre-approved by the ghosts of family tradition. Her world had shrunk to a small, predictable triangle: her apartment, the subway, and the office. On Saturdays, her one day of relative freedom, she would sometimes force herself to walk through different neighborhoods pretending to be a tourist in her own life. She'd watch children playing in the park, their laughter a sound from a foreign language. She'd see couples holding hands, their casual intimacy a spectacle of impossible longing. These excursions were meant to feel like freedom, but they only amplified her profound isolation. She was a spectator, always on the outside looking in, separated from the vibrant pulse of human connection by an invisible pane of glass. The city, with its millions of stories, only served to highlight the stark, terrifying emptiness of her own unwritten pages, reinforcing the oppressive reality of her solitude. The moral calculus of her existence was punishingly simple. Her mother had endured years of pain without complaint, her grace a quiet, powerful sermon on the nature of sacrifice. In the face of such strength, Ellie's own loneliness felt like a selfish, indulgent complaint. How could she possibly justify spending money on a concert ticket or a new dress when that same money could go toward the debt, a tangible monument to her mother's struggle? This self-enforced austerity was a form of penance, a way to stay connected to her mother's suffering. She believed, on a subconscious level, that she did not deserve joy. Happiness was a luxury reserved for those who had not been so intimately acquainted with loss. Her duty was to work, to pay, to remember, and to exist in a state of perpetual quiet atonement for a crime she never committed. There were moments, however, when the dormant artist within her would stir. Standing in front of a small, dusty bookstore one afternoon, she saw a beautifully illustrated volume on the art of kintsugi, the Japanese practice of repairing broken pottery with gold lacquer. The philosophy that an object is more beautiful for having been broken resonated deep within her soul. For a fleeting, breathtaking moment, she allowed herself to dream. She imagined a small workshop, sunlight streaming through the window, her hands covered in gold dust as she mended the fractured beauty of the world. The vision was so vivid, so full of light and purpose, that its disappearance was a physical blow, leaving her gasping on a cold city street. It was a cruel glimpse of a life she felt she had no right to claim, a painful reminder of the chasm between who she was and who she might have been. As evening fell, her reflection in the dark glass of her window became a ghostly superimposition over the glittering, indifferent city. She saw a woman trapped between two worlds, the quiet, mournful past, and a future that felt like a continuation of the same gray servitude. First, she had served her mother's illness. Now she served her mother's debt. The role was the same, only the master had changed. A profound sense of resignation settled over her, cold and heavy as a shroud. She was being groomed for a life devoid of passion, a life of duty and obligation, a slow, quiet fading into nothingness. The oppressive weight of her circumstances, her family's expectations, and her own crushing guilt had created a perfect prison, and she stood there, a willing inmate, with no idea that the warden of a very different kind of prison was about to turn the key. He was a myth before he was a man. Damian Blackwood did not walk the floors of his company. He haunted them. His presence was announced not by footsteps, but by a sudden, palpable drop in temperature, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the open-plan office. Conversations would cease, replaced by the frantic, focused clicking of keyboards. People sat straighter, their gazes fixed on their screens, as if their very survival depended on it. Eleanor had heard the stories, whispered in the break room like cautionary tales for children. They spoke of a man forged in ice and ambition, a titan who had clawed his way back from a devastating betrayal that had left him emotionally barren. He was the king of this glass and steel castle, and his heart, they said, was the coldest room of all. He was less a CEO and more a force of nature, a storm front everyone prayed would pass them by. The first time she saw him up close, the myth solidified into a terrifying reality. He stepped out of his private elevator, a figure carved from shadow and expensive wool. He was tall, his frame lean and predatory beneath a bespoke charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light around it. His movements were economical and precise, devoid of any wasted gesture. There was an unnerving stillness about him, the coiled calm of a panther assessing its territory, but it was his face that held her captive. It was a collection of harsh, beautiful angles, dominated by eyes the color of a winter storm, intelligent and utterly devoid of warmth. They swept across the room with an imperious disinterest, cataloging everything and valuing nothing. In that single, sweeping glance, Ellie felt herself reduced to a piece of furniture, an insignificant part of the inventory in a kingdom he owned completely. The collision was inevitable, a meeting of chaos and order. Rushing to deliver a set of urgent, leather-bound portfolios for a board meeting, Ellie turned a corner too quickly, her worn-out flats skidding on the polished marble. The portfolios flew from her grasp, a cascade of expensive paper and leather scattering across the floor directly in his path. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. The world narrowed to the sight of those pristine documents, now splayed in disarray at the feet of the most powerful man in the building. A mortified silence fell over the entire floor. It was a profound, suffocating quiet, broken only by the frantic, useless beating of her own heart. She had done the one thing she was most terrified of. She had become a disruption, a messy, clumsy flaw in his perfect, ordered world, and now she was trapped in the epicenter of his attention. He stopped, his polished Italian shoes inches from a scattered page. He didn't look down at the mess. His gaze remained fixed on her, and the sheer force of it was a physical blow. There was no anger in his eyes, no flicker of irritation. There was something far worse. A cold, analytical contempt, the look one might give an insect that had crawled across a priceless manuscript. He didn't speak immediately, letting the silence stretch until it was a tangible, agonizing thing. Ellie's face burned with a heat so intense she thought she might faint. She wanted to evaporate, to melt into the floor, to become as invisible as she had always tried to be. But there was no escape. She was pinned by his stare, a fragile specimen under the microscope of a man who dissected weaknesses for a living, and she knew she was utterly transparent to him. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the chilling precision of a scalpel. "My firm does not have the budget to accommodate incompetence," he said, the words low and perfectly enunciated. "You are an assistant. The role requires you to assist, not to obstruct. Is that concept too complex for you to grasp?" Each word was a deliberate, calculated strike, designed not to reprimand, but to dismantle. He wasn't just angry about the dropped papers. He was offended by her very presence, by the sheer audacity of her imperfection in his curated space. He saw her as a symptom of a larger disease. The chaos of human error, the very thing he had spent years ruthlessly purging from his life and his company. Her clumsiness was a personal affront to the absolute control he craved and commanded. Ellie could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity from her colleagues. Her throat was tight, her lungs burning for air. She expected to cry, to stammer out a pathetic, fumbling apology. Instead, a strange, quiet resolve settled over her. She met his gaze for a fraction of a second before lowering her eyes, a silent act of deference that was not born of fear, but of a profound, bone-deep weariness. "I apologize, Mr. Blackwood," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. She knelt, her hands shaking as she began to gather the scattered documents. She moved with a practiced, gentle care, her ink-stained fingers treating the expensive portfolios with the same reverence she would a fragile 100-year-old book. She did not rush, she simply endured, absorbing his contempt into her silence. For the first time, a flicker of something other than disdain crossed Damien's face. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible shift, a momentary break in his icy composure. He had expected tears, excuses, or the defiant glare of a lesser employee. He had not expected this quiet, dignified submission. It was unnerving. As she knelt, he noticed the faint scent of old paper and lemon tea that clung to her. A scent that was jarringly out of place amidst the sterile, metallic perfume of his building. He saw the careful, precise way her fingers aligned the edges of the papers, a gesture of restoration that seemed instinctual. Her resilience was not a challenge to his authority, but it was a puzzle, and Damien Blackwood despised puzzles he could not immediately solve. He felt a strange, unwelcome stirring of curiosity, an emotion he had long since cauterized. He turned without another word, his dismissal as absolute as his arrival, and swept toward the boardroom, leaving her on the floor in his wake. The spell was broken. The ambient noise of the office slowly returned, though it was now laced with hushed whispers and sidelong glances in her direction. Ellie finished gathering the last portfolio, her body trembling with delayed shock. The humiliation was a raw, open wound, but beneath it lay something else, something confusing and potent. For 30 agonizing seconds, she had been the absolute center of his world. His focus had been so intense, so complete, that it felt like a brand. She felt not just seen, but dissected, as if his cold eyes had bypassed her clumsy exterior and peered directly into the fragile, frightened core of her and had found it wanting. She escaped to the sterile solitude of the ladies' room, locking herself in a stall and pressing her forehead against the cool metal of the door. Her reflection in the small, polished handle was a distorted, pathetic version of herself. She replayed his words, the precise, cruel cadence of his voice. She should have been terrified. She should have been drafting her resignation letter in her head. A part of her was. But another, deeper part of her felt a strange, dangerous pull. It was the same fascination a moth feels for a flame, the irresistible draw toward an intensity that promised annihilation. He was a broken thing, just like her books, but his fractures were sharp, dangerous shards of glass, not the gentle, worn-out paper she knew how to mend. She was terrified of him, and yet a treacherous part of her wondered what it would be like to touch those sharp edges. Later that day, from the isolation of his penthouse office, Damien Blackwood stared out at the city he had conquered, but his victory felt hollow. The view was a testament to his control, to his ruthless ability to bend the world to his will. Yet his thoughts kept drifting back to the scene on the marble floor. He couldn't shake the image of her quiet, trembling hands, the ink stains on her fingertips or the scent of old books that had briefly disrupted his sterile kingdom. She was a flaw, a disruption, a piece of chaos that had trespassed into his sanctuary. He should have fired her on the spot. But he hadn't. The memory of her quiet endurance was a burr under his skin, an irritating, unwelcome presence in the fortress of his mind. The first, fragile thread of a connection he never wanted, had been pulled taut, and it vibrated with a tension that was as terrifying as it was undeniable. The aftermath of their confrontation left a strange residue in the air, an invisible film of tension that coated every surface between them. Damien Blackwood began to watch her. It was no longer the dismissive, contemptuous glare of a superior assessing an underling. It was a focused, unnervingly analytical observation. From the fortress of his glass-walled office, his gaze would follow her as she moved through the bullpen. He noted the quiet, almost reverent way she handled documents, the intuitive precision with which she organized his chaotic schedule, and the subtle grace that occasionally broke through her clumsy exterior. He told himself it was simple due diligence, a re-evaluation of a problematic employee. But the intensity felt far too personal, an obsessive cataloging of a woman who was fast becoming a dangerous anomaly in his rigidly controlled world. The first tremor in this new, fragile dynamic came not from Damien, but from his senior partners, Marcus Thorne and Julian Croft. They were the polished, charismatic princes of Blackwood Capital, men who wielded their power with a smile rather than a scowl. Marcus, the gentler of the two, stopped by her desk one morning. "Eleanor," he said, his voice warm and genuine, "that brief you prepared for the Henderson merger was flawless. Your attention to detail is remarkable." Unaccustomed to any form of praise, Ellie felt a hot blush creep up her neck. She stammered a thank you, her eyes fixed on her keyboard. The simple, kind words were a balm on the raw wounds of Damien's constant criticism, a tiny, unfamiliar spark of validation that made her feel, for a fleeting moment, visible. From his perch, Damien saw it all. He watched Marcus lean over her desk, saw the warm smile, and observed the deep, embarrassed blush that colored Ellie's cheeks. A cold, unfamiliar sensation, sharp and bitter, coiled in the pit of his stomach. He recognized it with a jolt of self-loathing. Jealousy. It was an illogical, pathetic emotion he had long ago purged from his system. Annoyed at his own reaction and at the disruption, he pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Miss Vance, my office. Now." His voice was clipped, cold. When she entered, he subjected her to a series of rapid-fire, impersonal questions about quarterly reports. His tone, a clear reassertion of his dominance, a reminder of who truly controlled her time and her attention. The partner's interest, however, was not so easily dissuaded. A few days later, a stunning, single red rose appeared on her desk, delivered by an office courier. There was no card, but the knowing smirk from Julian Croft as he passed by told her everything she needed to know. The gesture was public, ostentatious, and felt less like a compliment and more like a claim. The office began to buzz with hushed whispers and speculative glances. Ellie was mortified. The unwanted attention made her feel like a specimen under glass, a pawn in a game of power and ego she had no desire to play. The rose, with its perfect velvety petals, sat on her desk like a scarlet brand, marking her as an object of interest in a world where she desperately wanted to remain invisible. Damien's response was a masterpiece of silent, brutal efficiency. He emerged from his office, striding toward the elevators. On his way, he passed her desk, and without breaking stride or making eye contact, his hand shot out, plucked the rose from its delicate vase, and continued walking. A few feet later, he dropped it into a nearby trash receptacle, with the same dispassion he would show to a crumpled memo. The entire act took less than 5 seconds. The message, however, was deafeningly clear and chillingly possessive. For Ellie, watching him, the moment was a confusing vortex of terror and a strange, dark thrill. He had protected her from the unwanted attention, but it was the protection of a dragon guarding its treasure, fierce, absolute, and utterly terrifying. His behavior toward her began to shift into a new, suffocating pattern. He manufactured reasons to keep her working late, long after the rest of the office had emptied. The tasks he assigned were impossibly complex, designed to consume all her time and energy, effectively isolating her. He would often linger near her desk under the guise of overseeing her work, his presence a heavy, electric weight in the silence. His criticisms became more frequent and intensely personal, no longer focused on her performance but on her very nature. "Must you be so hesitant, Ms. Vance?" Indecision is a fatal flaw. The proximity was a form of torture, a constant, nerve-shredding dance on the edge of an unspoken precipice, leaving her both drained and dangerously wired. One evening, as they worked in the vast, silent cavern of the empty office, a violent thunderstorm broke over the city, the sky split open by jagged flashes of lightning. A particularly loud clap of thunder rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows, and Ellie flinched involuntarily, a small gasp escaping her lips. Damien, who had been staring at his monitor, looked over at her. For a split second, the cold mask of the CEO vanished, replaced by a flicker of raw, unguarded concern. His voice, when he spoke, was rough and low, stripped of its usual icy authority. "Are you afraid of storms?" The question was so startlingly personal, so far beyond the boundaries of their professional relationship, that it hung in the charged air between them like a fragile, trembling thread. Caught off guard by this unexpected glimpse of the man beneath the armor, Ellie felt her own defenses crumble. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not her tormentor, but a lonely man silhouetted against a stormy sky. "Sometimes," she whispered, the simple, honest admission feeling as momentous as a confession, the silence that followed was dense with unspoken things, loneliness, fear, a shared sense of being trapped. He held her gaze for a moment longer than he should have, a silent communication passing between them before he abruptly turned away, his composure restored. But the damage was done. The brief, shared moment of vulnerability had irrevocably altered the landscape between them, a crack in the foundation of their animosity. A week later, the official announcement for the annual Blackwood Charity Gala circulated through the office. It was the most exclusive event of the year, a glittering affair where the city's elite came to mingle and display their wealth. Ellie barely glanced at the email, automatically filing it away. Such events belonged to a different universe, one inhabited by the women in designer dresses and sharp stilettos she saw striding through the lobby. She overheard Marcus Thorne discussing table arrangements with a colleague, and he caught her eye, offering a warm, conspiratorial smile. The thought of attending, of wearing a beautiful dress and feeling like part of that world, was a distant, impossible fantasy, like a story from one of her old books. Later that afternoon, Marcus approached her desk, his demeanor kind and respectful. "Eleanor," he began, his voice low so as not to attract attention. "I know this is forward, and please feel free to say no, but I was wondering if you might consider attending the gala with me. As my guest." He seemed to sense her hesitation. "Just as friends, I think you deserve a night to enjoy yourself, away from all this." The offer was a lifeline, a tangible path to a normal life. It represented safety, kindness, and the simple, uncomplicated validation of being asked out by a good man. It was a chance to be the woman her mother had always wanted her to be, to step into a world of light and normalcy. A war raged within her. Every sensible instinct screamed for her to accept. Marcus was offering a perfect, risk-free evening. It was a step toward independence, a chance to feel desirable and normal. Yet an image of Damien's face, cold and possessive, flashed in her mind. The thought of appearing at the gala on another man's arm felt like a reckless act of defiance, a deliberate provocation of a powerful, volatile man. The gravity of his dark interest had become a strange, compelling force in her life. She was caught in an impossible dilemma: the safe harbor offered by Marcus, or the terrifying magnetic pull of the storm that was Damien Blackwood. She was paralyzed by the choice. Before she could form a reply to Marcus, a sterile, one-line email from Damien's private account appeared on her screen. "My office. Now." The command brooked no delay. She walked the long corridor on unsteady legs, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. When she entered, he was standing with his back to her, a dark silhouette against the sprawling cityscape. He didn't turn around immediately, letting the silence stretch, amplifying the crushing tension in the room. He was a predator, and she had just walked willingly into his cage, the door clicking shut behind her with a dreadful finality. She felt stripped bare under the weight of his unspoken scrutiny. Finally he turned, and his eyes, the color of a winter storm, pinned her in place. "You will be attending the Blackwood Charity Gala," he said. It was not a question or a request. It was a statement of fact. "You will attend as my assistant for the evening. Your duties will be to manage my schedule and ensure my interactions run smoothly." The words were cloaked in the language of business, but the intent beneath was a raw, brutal claim. He was not inviting her. He was conscripting her. He was marking his territory in front of the entire world, ensuring that everyone, especially Marcus and Julian, understood that she was with him. She belonged to him for the evening. Ellie felt the walls of the trap closing in. The choice she had been agonizing over had just been violently taken from her. Now she was faced with a different kind of decision: submission or rebellion. A tiny, desperate spark of defiance flickered within her. She had to try, had to grasp for some semblance of control over her own life. Her voice was barely a whisper, a ghost of its true volume, but she forced the words out. "What if I already have plans, Mr. Blackwood?" It was a pathetic shield against his iron will, a fragile last stand for her own autonomy, and she knew, even as she said it, that it was utterly futile. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, then another, methodically erasing the space between them until she was forced to tilt her head back to look at him. She could feel the heat from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of his expensive cologne. "Then you will cancel them," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous current that vibrated through her very bones. "You work for me, Miss Vance. On that night, your time belongs to me. Is that understood?" The professional pretense had been completely stripped away. This was not about work. This was personal, primal, and possessively raw. It was a battle of wills she had no hope of winning. A declaration of ownership that was both terrifying and shamefully thrilling. Looking up into his stormy eyes, she expected to see only cold, arrogant victory. Instead, for a fleeting instant, she saw something else lurking in the depths. A flicker of raw desperation, a flash of profound fear. It was the fear of losing something he hadn't even allowed himself to admit he wanted. It was this unexpected crack in his perfect icy control, this glimpse of the wounded man beneath the tyrant, that ultimately undid her. A perilous, traitorous wave of empathy washed over her, extinguishing her small flame of rebellion. Her choice was no longer about her job or her fear, it was about him. A sense of profound, terrifying inevitability settled over her. She had made her choice, or perhaps the choice had been made for her the moment he first looked at her. She was choosing the storm over the harbor, the dangerous unknown over the promised safety. Her voice was steady now, imbued with a strange, quiet resolve as she met his intense gaze. "I understand, Mr. Blackwood." She had just agreed to step into the heart of the fire. She was no longer a restorer of broken objects from a safe distance. She was walking directly toward the most beautifully, dangerously shattered man she had ever known, with no idea if he would be her ultimate ruin or her impossible redemption. The dress felt like borrowed skin, a whisper of deep sapphire silk that was entirely alien to her. It was a loan from a sympathetic colleague, a costume for a role Eleanor did not know how to play. The Blackwood Charity Gala was a universe of calculated light and sound, where laughter was like the clinking of crystal and smiles were financial instruments. She stood beside Marcus Thorne, a warm, solid presence in the overwhelming sea of glitter and power. He was kindness made manifest, his conversation easy, his attention a gentle spotlight that didn't burn. Yet, even as he spoke, her eyes kept drifting across the cavernous ballroom, searching for a shadow in the brightness, a storm cloud in the perfect, cloudless sky. She was an archivist in a world of fleeting moments, and she felt a desperate, foolish urge to document the one man who made her feel dangerously real. Marcus led her to the dance floor, his hand a respectful warmth at the small of her back. The music was a gentle, sweeping waltz, and for the first time all evening, Ellie felt a measure of peace settle in her bones. Marcus was an effortless leader, guiding her through the steps with a quiet confidence that soothed her frayed nerves. He said something witty, a light-hearted observation about one of the city's more eccentric billionaires, and a sound escaped her that was entirely foreign. It was a laugh. Not a polite titter or a nervous giggle, but a genuine, unburdened peal of laughter. It felt like a bird taking flight from a cage she hadn't known was locked. In that moment, she was not the clumsy assistant or the grieving daughter. She was simply a woman, laughing, bathed in the warm glow of chandeliers, experiencing a fragile, perfect moment of normalcy. Across the room, standing in the deep shadows near a marble column, Damian Blackwood watched the scene unfold. He saw the way the sapphire dress clung to her form, the way the light caught in her hair, but it was the sound of her laughter that struck him like a physical blow. He had never heard it before. In his world, she was a creature of silence, of apologetic whispers and trembling hands. To hear that sound, so full of light and directed at another man, was a profound and agonizing violation. It was a glimpse of a world she could inhabit without him, a world where she was happy. A savage, primitive fire ignited in his veins, burning away the last vestiges of his ironclad control. He was no longer the CEO, the titan, the master of the universe. He was just a man, watching the one thing he secretly craved being given freely to someone else. He moved. It was not a walk, but a predatory stalk, a direct, unswerving path through the swirling couples that parted before him as if sensing the dangerous charge in the air. He reached them in the middle of a turn, and he did not ask or interrupt. He simply acted. His hand closed around Ellie's arm, his grip firm, a brand of heat and possession that seared through the delicate silk. Marcus stopped, his expression a mask of stunned confusion. "Blackwood, what the hell?" he began, but Damien's eyes, chips of glacial ice, silenced him. He didn't spare Marcus another glance. His entire focus was on Ellie as he pulled her from the safety of Marcus's arms, the silent, public act of claiming 1,000 times more brutal than any spoken word. The music seemed to falter, and a ripple of shocked whispers followed in their wake. He dragged her through the glittering throng, his grip unrelenting. She stumbled behind him, a captive in his silent, furious wake. The world became a dizzying kaleidoscope of crystal, silk, and astonished faces. She didn't fight him. A terrifying current of inevitability had seized her, a feeling that this moment had been destined since she first spilled those papers at his feet. He pulled her through a set of tall glass doors and out onto a deserted terrace. The sudden silence, a deafening contrast to the ballroom symphony. The sharp bite of the cold night air was a shock to her system, a slap of reality. They were alone, suspended between the glittering party and the infinite jeweled darkness of the city skyline. His city, his world, and she was now a trespasser in its most volatile private chamber. He finally released her, his chest rising and falling with a tightly controlled rage. He turned to face her, a dark, powerful silhouette against the city lights. The silence stretched between them, thick with accusation and 1,000 unspoken things. Ellie, trembling from the cold and the adrenaline, found a sliver of courage born from sheer desperation. She had to know. She had to understand the reason for this madness, for this possessive, terrifying hold he had on her. "What do you want from me?" she cried, her voice a raw, ragged thing, torn from the deepest part of her soul. It was not a question of employment or duty. It was a plea, a demand to understand why he looked at her as if she were both the wound and the only possible cure. For a moment he looked as if the question had broken him. His face was a mask of torment in the dim light, his control shattered into a million pieces. He took a step toward her, then another, his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic light she had never seen before. He didn't answer with words. Words were his weapons, his tools of control, and he had none left. Instead, he closed the final distance between them, his hands coming up to cup her face, his touch not gentle but desperate, as if he were a dying man holding his last prayer. And then his mouth was on hers. It was not a seduction, but a collision. It was a desperate, punishing kiss, a raw, frantic confession of a need so profound it bordered on madness, a primal claim staked in the face of the entire world. The initial shock of the kiss was a jolt of lightning through her system, fierce and overwhelming. It was a kiss of anger, of jealousy, of a deep, soul-crushing loneliness. She tasted his desperation, his fear, and it resonated with the vast, empty spaces inside her own heart. A lifetime of deferred desire, of untouched skin, and unfulfilled longing erupted within her. This was her ultimate transgression. She was not just kissing her cold, cruel boss. She was choosing the storm, embracing the fire, and surrendering to the one man who had the power to utterly destroy her. Her hands, which had been pressed against his chest in a futile gesture of defense, slowly uncurled, fisting in the lapels of his jacket as she answered his desperation with a lifetime of unspoken yearning, kissing him back with a ferocity that matched his own. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both gasping for air, the cold night air burning their lungs. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his body trembling with the force of his unleashed emotions. In that moment, the mask of the Titan was gone, stripped away by his own violent surrender. When he opened his eyes, she saw not the arrogant CEO or the cold-hearted tyrant, but the broken man beneath. His gaze was filled with a raw, unguarded terror, the look of a man staring over the edge of a cliff he had just willingly thrown himself from. He was exposed, vulnerable, and utterly horrified by the truth the kiss had revealed. That he needed her, and this need was a weakness he could not control, a flaw in his meticulously constructed armor that she had just irrevocably breached. He said nothing. There were no words that could follow a moment like that. With a shuddering breath, he took a step back, the space between them once again a chasm of cold air and unspoken consequences. His expression was shuttered, the mask of indifference slowly, painfully sliding back into place. Without another glance, he turned and walked back into the glittering light of the party, leaving her alone on the windswept terrace. The warmth of the ballroom seemed a world away. Ellie stood frozen, her fingers tracing the outline of her lips, where the echo of the kiss was a brand on her skin. She had transgressed, she had surrendered, and in doing so she had witnessed the shattering of Damian Blackwood. She was left alone in the cold, with the impossible, terrifying knowledge that she was the one holding the hammer. The walk back into the ballroom was a journey through a foreign country. The music, which had moments before felt like a promise of joy, now sounded tinny and mocking. The glittering lights of the chandeliers seemed harsh, exposing her in a way she had never felt before. Every head she passed seemed to turn. Every pair of eyes felt like an accusation. She could feel the brand of his kiss on her lips, a phantom heat that was both a secret and a public shame. She saw Marcus across the room, his expression a complicated mixture of concern and a deep, quiet hurt that cut her more than any overt anger could have. She felt like a piece of shattered glass, reflecting the judgment of the entire room. She had transgressed, not just against propriety, but against the very fabric of the quiet, invisible life she had so carefully constructed for herself. She fled without a word to anyone, slipping through a service exit and into the cold, anonymous embrace of the city night. Huddled in the back of a taxi, she watched the vibrant, indifferent lights of New York streak past the window in a watercolor blur. The city had never felt so vast, so lonely. She pressed her fingers to her lips. The memory of his desperate, punishing kiss a visceral jolt to her system. It hadn't been a kiss of affection. It was a raw, brutal act of possession, a confession of a need so deep it had shattered his legendary control. And she, in her lifetime of quiet yearning, had answered it. The shame was a hot, coiling thing in her stomach, but beneath it, a terrifying, unfamiliar current of power began to stir. For the first time in her life, she had been a catalyst. She had made the storm break. The next morning, the office of Blackwood Capital was a tomb of silent judgment. The usual morning chatter was replaced by a suffocating quiet, punctuated by the staccato clicking of keyboards. As Eleanor walked to her desk, conversations died in her wake, and she felt the weight of dozens of sidelong glances. The air was thick with the gossip she couldn't hear but could feel on her skin like a static charge. Marcus Thorne gave her a brief, pained nod, his usual warmth extinguished. Julian Croft watched her with an amused, predatory glint in his eye, as if she were a fascinating new specimen. She felt profoundly and utterly alone, an exile in the very place she had once tried so desperately to be invisible. She had wanted to be seen, and now that she was, she found the scrutiny to be an unbearable, crushing weight. Damian Blackwood's silence was the most damning consequence of all. He retreated behind a wall of ice, thicker and more impenetrable than ever before. He did not look at her, speak to her, or acknowledge her existence beyond the sterile, impersonal commands delivered via email. He was a ghost in his own glass office, a remote, untouchable deity of commerce who had erased their moment on the terrace from existence. To Ellie, this absolute withdrawal was a brutal confirmation of her deepest fears. That the kiss had been a moment of madness, a regrettable loss of control he now despised. It was a rejection not just of the act, but of her. She was the flaw, the mistake, the living embodiment of a weakness he could not tolerate. His coldness was a constant, public punishment for her part in his fall from grace. A suffocating blanket of guilt settled over her, heavy and suffocating as a winter shroud. She had betrayed Marcus's simple, genuine kindness, transforming his gentle offer into a spectacle of humiliation. She had jeopardized the very job she needed to honor her mother's memory, the one tangible thing she could do to atone for the cost of her illness. In her mind, she heard her mother's voice, whispering of a safe life, a good man, a quiet happiness. She had torched that possibility on the terrace, trading the promise of a safe harbor for a single, fiery moment with a man who was the human equivalent of a shipwreck. The guilt was a physical ache in her chest, a constant reminder that she had failed in her duty, choosing a dangerous, selfish desire over the quiet, respectable path that had been laid out for her. Yet, deep beneath the layers of guilt and fear, something else was taking root. It was a strange, unfamiliar sensation, a quiet hum of defiance in her blood. The kiss had been terrifying, but it had also been the first truly honest moment she had experienced in years. In his desperation, she had felt a power she never knew she possessed. He had seen her. Not the clumsy assistant or the dutiful daughter, but a force capable of cracking his perfect cold facade. A slow-burning anger began to smolder within her. She was angry at his cowardice, at his immediate cruel retreat into silence. She was angry at the whispering judgment of her colleagues, but most of all she was angry at herself, for the years she had spent apologizing for her own existence, for making herself small to fit into a world that had never made room for her. That evening, in the quiet sanctuary of her apartment, she stood before the living room that had become a shrine to her mother. The worn shawl was still draped over the sofa, the medical books still lined the shelves. It was a room suffocating with the past. For months, she hadn't dared to move a single object, fearing it would be a betrayal. Now, moved by a new, uncertain impulse, she walked to the sofa. She picked up the shawl, its familiar lavender scent filling her senses. But instead of holding it to her face for comfort, she folded it with a slow, deliberate reverence. She walked to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed and placed it inside, closing the lid with a soft, definitive click. It was not an act of forgetting, but an act of claiming. She was making room for the present. The Sunday call from her Aunt Carol was a predictable storm of passive-aggressive concern. "Eleanor, I heard the most distressing thing from Susan Miller. Her daughter was at that gala," she began, her voice dripping with pity. "They said you made quite a scene with that difficult man you work for." "Oh, darling, your mother would be so worried. A young woman's reputation is such a fragile thing." In the past, these words would have sent Ellie into a spiral of shame. Today, they landed like pebbles against a newly forged shield. "Thank you for your concern, Aunt Carol," Ellie said, her voice quiet but firm, devoid of its usual tremor. "But I can manage my own life." She ended the call before her aunt could respond, the simple act of hanging up feeling like a profound declaration of independence. Working late one night to avoid the lingering tension of the office, Ellie saw a single light still burning on the executive floor. It was Damien's office. Drawn by a force she didn't understand, she took the elevator up, stopping in the darkened corridor where she could see him through the glass walls. He was not working. He stood with his back to the door, a dark silhouette against the glittering expanse of the city, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He looked utterly, profoundly alone, a king in a cold, empty castle. She saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the posture of a man at war with himself. In that moment, she understood. His coldness was not a weapon directed at her. It was a shield he held against himself. He was not punishing her. He was punishing himself for wanting her. A profound and terrifying clarity descended upon her as she stood there in the shadows, watching the man who had both broken and awakened her. The fear of having ruined everything was still a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer her master. It was simply a part of the landscape now. Running away, quitting her job, and retreating back into the safety of her quiet, unlived life was the easy path. It was the path the old Eleanor would have taken without a second thought. But the woman who had kissed Damien Blackwood back on that terrace, the woman who had folded her mother's shawl away, could not go back. She made a decision, not with logic, but with a deep, instinctual certainty. She would stay. She would face the silence. She would endure the consequences. She was a restorer of broken things, and she would not abandon the most beautifully, tragically shattered story she had ever found. The weeks that followed settled into a new kind of silence. It was no longer the cold, punishing void of his rejection, but a shared, charged atmosphere, thick with the unspoken. Eleanor moved through the sterile halls of Blackwood Capital with a quiet purpose that was entirely her own. She no longer apologized for the space she occupied. Her clumsiness receded, replaced by a graceful efficiency that was its own form of silent rebellion. She performed her duties with meticulous care, each perfectly organized file, each anticipated request, a message in a language only the two of them understood. She did not seek his gaze through the glass wall of his office, but she felt it on her constantly, a heavy, watchful presence. She was no longer a mouse cowering from a predator. She was a still point in his storm, waiting with a strength she hadn't known she possessed, knowing the battle was no longer between them, but within him. One evening, long after the river of suits had drained from the building, she found it resting on the corner of her desk. A book. It was a first edition of a classic novel, its dark leather cover worn smooth with time. the spine showing the faint, elegant fractures of a life well lived. There was no note, but she didn't need one. The offering was as intimate and revealing as a handwritten confession. It was a story of a destructive, all-consuming passion, of two souls irrevocably bound by their own darkness. She ran her ink-stained fingers over the embossed title, a gesture of profound recognition. This was his language. It was not an apology spoken in words he could not form, but a symbolic offering, a broken, beautiful thing entrusted to her care. He was showing her his soul, not as a perfect, polished artifact, but as a rare, damaged text he hoped she might know how to read. The next morning, she said nothing of the gift. Words would have been a clumsy intrusion, a desecration of their silent communion. Instead, when she delivered his morning coffee and the market reports, she left a small, slim volume on the polished surface of his desk. It was a collection of poetry she had painstakingly restored the night before, its torn cover mended with delicate, gold-flecked paper in the style of kintsugi, making the repair a beautiful feature rather than a hidden flaw. She returned to her desk without a backward glance, though her entire being was attuned to the space behind her. She saw his hand reach for the book, his long fingers tracing the golden seam of her repair. He did not open it. He simply held it. And in that charged stillness, an entire conversation unfolded, a mutual acknowledgement of their shared fractures, and the fragile, terrifying hope that they could be made beautiful again. The fragile truce held for days, a delicate web woven in the space between their desks. Then, one evening as she packed her bag, the quiet of the empty office was broken by the soft buzz of her intercom. His voice came through, not the clipped, authoritative command she was used to, but a low, rough sound, stripped of all its armor. Stay. The single word was not an order but a plea, a raw admission of need that hung in the air like a held breath. She stood frozen for a beat, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she set her bag down. He appeared in the doorway of his office, a dark figure against the light within. His jacket was gone, his sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and his tie was loose. He just stood there, looking at her, his winter storm eyes filled with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. He offered no explanation. He simply held her gaze, and in the profound, unnerving silence, she saw everything. She saw the ghost of a past betrayal that had taught him to equate love with ruin. She saw the crushing weight of a loneliness so absolute it had become the very architecture of his soul. And she saw the desperate, terrifying light of a man who had spent his life building walls, only to find the one person who could effortlessly walk through them. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the warm light of his office, a silent invitation into the very heart of his fortress. It was not a command. It was a surrender, an offering of trust so profound it made her ache. The last vestiges of her fear dissolved, replaced by a deep, resonant calm. She rose from her chair and took a single, unwavering step toward the open door. This was not the end of a story. It was the quiet, uncertain beginning of a far more complex one. It was not a promise of a simple happiness, but an acceptance of a beautiful, challenging restoration. She understood now that mending a person was not like mending a book. It required two sets of hands, working together in the patient, hopeful dark. He was a man made of sharp, broken edges, and she was a woman who had finally learned that her own gentle strength was more than enough to handle them. Their love story would be written not in grand declarations, but in shared silence, in the slow, careful mending of wounds, and in the profound courage it took to love the flaws in another. If you believe that broken things can become the most beautiful, please subscribe, share this story with someone you love, and comment below with what healing means to you.